Welcome to the channel Vitamin Stories. Today's story takes us to Vienna, Austria, on the evening of May 7th, 1824. Inside the theater Am Kärntner Tor, 3,000 people packed into every available seat, every box, every corner of standing room. The air buzzed with anticipation. They had come to witness something unprecedented. They had come to hear a new symphony from Ludwig van Beethoven, the greatest composer alive. But there was something the audience knew that made this evening different from any other premiere in history. The man who wrote this music, the man standing on stage preparing to conduct, was completely and utterly deaf. He could not hear a single note, not the violins, not the horns, not the singers about to perform. Nothing. Ludwig van Beethoven, at 53 years old, stood before the orchestra, his wild gray hair barely tamed, his clothes disheveled as always. He raised his arms. The musicians looked not at him, but at the actual conductor standing behind him, hidden from the audience's view. Beethoven's movements meant nothing. They were the gestures of a man conducting music that existed only in his mind. For the next 70 minutes, the orchestra performed Symphony No. 9. It was revolutionary. It was massive. It was the first symphony in history to include a full chorus and vocal soloists. The final movement featured Friedrich Schiller's Ode to Joy, a celebration of universal brotherhood. The music swelled and crashed like ocean waves, tender one moment, thunderous the next. And through it all, Beethoven conducted his silent performance completely unaware of what was happening around him. When the final note sounded, the audience erupted. 3,000 people leaped to their feet. They applauded, they shouted, they waved their handkerchiefs in the air, a sign of the highest approval. The ovation went on and on, from after wave of appreciation. Beethoven stood on stage, his back to the audience, still focused on the orchestra. He had no idea what was happening behind him. Finally, one of the soloists, the contralto Caroline Unger, walked over to him. She gently took his arm and turned him around to face the crowd. Only then did Beethoven see it. 3,000 people on their feet. Hands raised, faces wet with tears, mouths open in cheers he could not hear. And he began to cry. Here was the greatest composer who had ever lived, who had just premiered, perhaps, the greatest symphony ever written, and he could not hear a single second of it. He could not hear the applause. He could not hear the orchestra. He could not hear the voices singing his own words about joy and brotherhood. The man who gave the world some of its most beautiful music lived in complete and total silence. But behind this triumphant moment, behind the tears and the standing ovation, there is a story that is far more complex than you might imagine. This is not simply a story about a deaf musician. This is a story about a man who battled his own mind, his own body, and his own demons. A man who came from abuse and poverty. A man who thought about suicide. A man who fell in love and lost. A man who created beauty while drowning in darkness. Ludwig van Beethoven earned his place in history, but he paid a price that few understand. This is a difficult and intense story. It's a story about genius and suffering, about triumph and tragedy, about music that changed the world created by a man who could never hear it. So take a moment, breathe, and listen carefully. Before we begin, subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications so you never miss these important stories. And tell me in the comments which city and country you're listening from. Your participation helps keep these stories alive instead of forgotten. Let's begin. To understand how Beethoven became Beethoven, we must go back to December 16, 1770, in the city of Bonn, Germany. It was a cold winter day when Maria Magdalena van Beethoven gave birth to her second child, a boy they named Ludwig van Beethoven, after his grandfather. The Beethoven family lived in a small apartment in a building that still stands today. They were not wealthy. They were not aristocrats. Ludwig's father, Johann van Beethoven, was a court musician, a tenor singer who performed for the Elector of Cologne. But Johann had a problem. Actually, Johann had several problems. He was an alcoholic, he was violent, and he was desperately ambitious in all the wrong ways. Johann had witnessed something that obsessed him. Just 14 years earlier, in 1756, a boy named Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart had been born in Salzburg. By the time Mozart was 6 years old, his father Leopold was touring him across Europe as a child prodigy, a miracle, a gift from God. The Mozart family became famous. They became wealthy. They performed for kings and queens. Johann van Beethoven looked at his own son, Ludwig, and saw his ticket to that same fame and fortune. There was only one problem. Ludwig was not naturally inclined toward music the way Mozart had been, so Johann decided he would force it into him. Starting when Ludwig was just 4 years old, Johann began brutal music lessons. He would wake the boy in the middle of the night, drag him to the piano, and force him to practice for hours. If Ludwig made a mistake, Johann would hit him. If Ludwig cried, Johann would hit him harder. If Ludwig said he was tired, Johann would beat him until he sat back down at the piano. Neighbors later testified that they often heard the young boy crying through the walls late at night, begging to be allowed to sleep. This was Ludwig van Beethoven's childhood. Not wonder, not joy, not the kind of magical education Mozart received from a loving father. Beethoven learned music through fear and pain. His mother, Maria Magdalena, was a quiet woman, described by those who knew her as melancholy, always sad. She had already lost one child before Ludwig was born. She would go on to have 5 more children, but only 2 others would survive past infancy. She loved Ludwig, but she was powerless to protect him from his father. Beethoven would later say that his childhood had no happy memories. But here's what's remarkable. Despite the abuse, despite the fear, despite the tears and the beatings and the exhaustion, something was taking root in young Ludwig. Something his father could not see, could not understand, and certainly could not take credit for. Ludwig van Beethoven had talent. Not the effortless prodigy-style talent of Mozart, but something deeper, something harder, something that would prove to be far more revolutionary. In March 1778, when Ludwig was just 7 years old, Johann arranged his son's first public performance. He advertised it as the debut of a 6-year-old prodigy. Yes, Johann lied about his son's age by a full year, hoping to make the comparison to Mozart more impressive. The concert took place in Cologne. Ludwig performed on both piano and violin. The reviews were polite, but not enthusiastic. The audience recognized talent, but they did not witness a miracle. There were no gasps of amazement. No one called him the next Mozart. Johann was disappointed. He increased the intensity of the lessons. The beatings continued. The late-night practice sessions continued. Ludwig's childhood continued to be stolen hour by hour. But something else was happening that Johann didn't notice. Ludwig wasn't just learning to play music. He was beginning to understand it, to feel it, to hear patterns and structures that went beyond simple performance. By the time he was 10 years old, Ludwig was composing his own music. Not just exercises, not just simple melodies, but real compositions with harmony and structure. By age 11, he stopped attending regular school entirely. Instead, he became an assistant to the court organist Christian Gottlob Neef. This was the turning point. This was the moment when Beethoven found his first real teacher. Neef was everything Johann was not. He was kind. He was patient. He was genuinely interested in developing Ludwig's abilities, not exploiting them. Neef recognized something in the boy that went beyond technical skill. He saw creativity. He saw original thinking. He saw a mind that questioned why music had to follow certain rules. Under Neef's guidance, Ludwig studied the works of Johann Sebastian Bach, the German master, who had died 20 years before Ludwig was born. Bach's complex fugues and mathematical precision became the foundation of everything Beethoven would later create. Neef also did something unprecedented. In 1782, when Ludwig was just 11 years old, Neef helped him publish his first composition. It was a set of variations on a march. The publication listed the composer as Ludwig van Beethoven, the French version of his name that he would use for several more years. A published composer at 11 years old. Not bad for a boy whose father beat him to make him practice. But Neef saw beyond even that. He wrote in a magazine review that year, "This young genius deserves support to enable him to travel. He would surely become a second Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart if he continues as he has begun. A second Mozart." There was that comparison again. It would follow Beethoven his entire life. Always the second, always the comparison, never the original. Beethoven would spend his entire career proving that he was not a second anybody. He was the first Beethoven, and that would be more than enough. By the time Ludwig was 12, he had essentially become the family breadwinner. His father's alcoholism had worsened to the point where Johann could barely keep his position at court. The family was sliding into poverty. Ludwig took on more and more professional work as an organist, as a viola player in the court orchestra, as a harpsichord player, anything to bring in money. He was still a child. But childhood was something Ludwig van Beethoven never really had. In 1784, at age 13, Ludwig was officially appointed as assistant court organist. The position came with a salary. He was now a professional musician. He was supporting his mother and his two younger brothers, Caspar and Johann, who were just 10 and 8 years old. But despite all this responsibility, despite all this work, Ludwig was still learning, still growing, still absorbing everything he could about music. Neef continued to mentor him, introducing him to the works of Haydn, to the operas of Mozart, to the symphonies and sonatas that were defining the classical era of music. Ludwig studied them all obsessively, but he didn't just memorize them. He questioned them. Why do symphonies always have 4 movements? Why do sonatas follow this specific structure? Why can't the music be louder, more dramatic, more emotional? These questions would eventually revolutionize music. But in the 1780s, they were just the private thoughts of a teenage boy in a small German city, a boy who had bigger dreams than Bonn could contain. In 1787, when he was 16 years old, Ludwig made his first trip to Vienna, the music capital of Europe. The official reason was to study with Mozart himself. Can you imagine the young Beethoven, barely more than a boy, traveling hundreds of miles to meet the greatest living composer? There are stories, possibly legends, possibly true, that Beethoven actually played for Mozart. That Mozart listened and said, "Keep your eyes on him. Someday he will give the world something to talk about." But whether that meeting actually happened, we can't be sure. What we do know is that Beethoven's time in Vienna was cut short. Within 2 weeks, he received word that his mother was dying. He rushed back to Bonn. Maria Magdalena van Beethoven died of tuberculosis on July 17, 1787. She was only 40 years old. Ludwig was 16. His father collapsed completely into alcoholism. The responsibility for his 2 younger brothers fell entirely on Ludwig's shoulders. The next 5 years were the hardest of his life. He worked constantly. He composed when he could. He dreamed of returning to Vienna, of studying with the great masters, of becoming something more than a court musician in a provincial German city. And then, in 1792, opportunity arrived. Joseph Haydn, the most famous composer alive after Mozart's death the previous year, passed through Bonn on his way back from London. Someone arranged for Haydn to hear some of Beethoven's compositions. Haydn was impressed. He invited the young man to come to Vienna and study with him. This was the chance Beethoven had been waiting for. In November 1792, at 21 years old, Ludwig van Beethoven left Bonn. He would never return to his hometown. He would never see his father again. Johann van Beethoven would die 5 years later, alone and forgotten still, an alcoholic still bitter that his son had never become the prodigy he tried to beat into existence. But Ludwig was free now, free to go to Vienna, free to study with Haydn, free to become the musician he was meant to be. He had no idea that within 4 years he would begin to lose the one thing a musician cannot afford to lose: his hearing. When Ludwig van Beethoven arrived in Vienna in November 1792, he was 21 years old, awkward, unfashionable, and absolutely determined to succeed. He carried with him a letter from Count Ferdinand Waldstein, one of his patrons in Bonn, that read, "Through uninterrupted diligence, you will receive Mozart's spirit from Haydn's hands." Mozart's spirit from Haydn's hands. That was a lot of pressure. Vienna in 1792 was the center of the musical world. It was a city of over 200,000 people, a city of palaces and concert halls and aristocrats who competed with each other to host the best musical events in their homes. If you wanted to make it as a composer or performer, you had to make it in Vienna. Beethoven took a small apartment in the city and immediately began his studies with Haydn. But this relationship, which should have been the perfect master-student situation, was complicated from the start. Haydn was 60 years old, enormously famous and set in his ways. He composed in the elegant, balanced style of the classical period. Everything had its place. Everything followed rules that had been refined over decades. Music was meant to be beautiful, pleasant, uplifting. Beethoven was 21, rough around the edges, and had no interest in following rules just because they existed. He wanted to know why the rules existed. And if he didn't like the answer, he wanted to break them. Haydn found his new student talented, but stubborn, sometimes even rude. Beethoven found Haydn's teaching style too old-fashioned, not rigorous enough. Their lessons lasted only about a year before Beethoven quietly began studying with other teachers behind Haydn's back people, like Johann Schenk and Antonio Salieri. Yes, the same Salieri from the Mozart legends. But here's what's important. Despite their differences, despite the friction, Haydn recognized Beethoven's genius. And more than that, he introduced Beethoven to the right people. Vienna's aristocracy operated on a patronage system. If you were a talented musician, you needed aristocratic supporters who would pay you commission works from you and introduce you to other wealthy patrons. Without this support, you would starve. Haydn brought Beethoven into these circles. And despite his rough manners, despite his lack of social grace, despite the fact that he didn't bow and scrape The way most musicians did, the Viennese aristocracy fell in love with Beethoven. Why? Because when he sat down at the piano, he was magic. In the 1790s, there was a form of entertainment in Vienna called the piano duel. Two pianists would face off, taking turns performing, improvising, trying to outdo each other. The aristocrats would gather in their palaces, place bets, and watch these musical battles unfold. Beethoven became famous for these duels, and he never lost. Never. His style of playing was unlike anything Vienna had heard before. The pianos of that era were delicate instruments, much quieter and more fragile than modern pianos. Most pianists played with restraint, with elegance, with perfect control. Beethoven played like he was trying to break the instrument. He pounded the keys. He made the piano sing, roar, whisper, and scream. He broke strings regularly. He played with such emotional intensity that audiences were often moved to tears. But his real genius showed in improvisation. Give Beethoven a simple melody, any melody, and he could improvise variations for an hour, each one more complex and beautiful than the last. He could combine multiple melodies, weave them together, take them apart, rebuild them in ways that seemed impossible. One famous story tells of a duel between Beethoven and Daniel Steibelt, a famous pianist visiting Vienna. Steibelt went first, playing a brilliant improvisation that drew enthusiastic applause. Then he took a sheet of music from a cello piece Beethoven had written and set it on the piano upside down, essentially mocking it. Beethoven's turn. He walked to the piano. He took the same sheet of music Steibelt had mocked. He played 4 notes from it. Just 4 notes. And then he improvised for 30 minutes, building an entire musical universe from those 4 notes, demonstrating levels of creativity and technical skill that left the entire room speechless. Steibelt walked out in the middle of the performance and reportedly refused to ever be in the same city as Beethoven again. This was the young Beethoven. Confident, aggressive, unwilling to accept second place in anything. But he wasn't just a performer. He was composing. And his early compositions were already showing signs of something revolutionary. His early piano sonatas pushed the boundaries of what a sonata could be. They were longer. They were more dramatic. They were more emotionally direct. The aristocrats loved them. They commissioned more. They paid him handsomely. They invited him to their homes. Beethoven was becoming famous. And more than that, he was becoming financially independent in a way that no composer before him had been. Mozart, for all his genius, died in poverty, dependent on aristocratic whims. Haydn was technically an employee wearing a servant's uniform when working for the Esterházy family. But Beethoven insisted on being treated as an equal. He was a musician, yes, but he was also an artist, a genius in his own right. If aristocrats wanted his music, they would pay for it fairly, and they would treat him with respect. Shockingly, they agreed. This was unprecedented. Beethoven was changing not just music, but the entire relationship between artists and their patrons. In 1798, Beethoven published his Piano Sonata No. 8 in C minor, Opus 13. He gave it a title, Pathétique, meaning emotional, passionate, full of feeling. This piece was unlike anything that had been published before. The opening is almost violent, loud chords that demand attention. Then, in the second movement, some of the most tender, beautiful melody ever written for piano. The contrast is shocking. It's as if 2 completely different pieces of music are fighting for control. This was Beethoven's innovation. Contrast. Drama. emotion that went beyond what was considered proper for classical music. The piece was an immediate success. It spread across Europe. Every pianist wanted to play it. Every piano student wanted to learn it. Then, in 1800, Beethoven premiered his Symphony No. 1. By the standards of what came later, Symphony No. 1 is actually quite traditional. It follows most of the rules that Haydn and Mozart had established for symphonic form. But there are moments, just moments where you can hear Beethoven testing the boundaries, pushing a little harder, being a little louder, a little more dramatic than was expected. The premiere took place on April 2, 1800, at the Burg Theater in Vienna. The concert also featured pieces by Mozart and Haydn, as well as some of Beethoven's other works. The response was enthusiastic. Critics praised the symphony's energy and originality, while noting that Beethoven was perhaps a bit too fond of unusual harmonies and loud dynamics. Beethoven didn't care about the mild criticisms. He was just getting started. By 1801, he was working on his second symphony. He was planning his third. He was composing piano sonatas, string quartets, a ballet violin. Sonatas. The music poured out of him. Ideas came faster than he could write them down. At age 30, Ludwig van Beethoven stood at the peak of success. He was famous throughout Europe. He was financially secure. He had the support of Vienna's most powerful aristocrats, including Archduke Rudolf, who would become a lifelong patron and friend. He was considered one of the greatest pianists alive, and a composer who might one day rival even Haydn. His future seemed unlimited. Everything was possible. Everything was ahead of him. And that's when he noticed the ringing in his ears. At first it was just a minor annoyance, a slight buzzing, some difficulty hearing high-pitched sounds. He assumed it was temporary, maybe an infection, maybe just stress. But it wasn't temporary, and it wasn't going away. By 1801, Beethoven realized the truth. He was going deaf. The greatest pianist in Vienna, one of the most promising composers in Europe, going deaf. He told no one. He hid it. He avoided conversations in loud rooms. He stood closer to people when they spoke. He pretended. He smiled. He nodded. And inside he was terrified. Because Beethoven understood what this meant. For a musician, deafness wasn't just a disability. It was a death sentence. The first person Beethoven told about his hearing loss was Dr. Johann Adam Schmidt in 1800. The doctor examined him and prescribed various treatments. Almond oil drops in his ears, lukewarm baths, special diets, electrical therapy, which involved mild electric shocks to the ears. Nothing worked. Beethoven consulted other doctors. He tried every treatment available. He traveled to rural areas hoping clean air and quiet would restore his hearing. He stopped drinking coffee. He changed his diet. He did everything they told him. His hearing continued to deteriorate. By 1801, he could barely hear conversations unless people spoke directly into his ear loudly. High-pitched sounds disappeared first. Women's voices became harder to understand. The upper registers of the piano faded away. Then the middle ranges began to go. Beethoven confessed his condition to two close friends in letters written in 1801. To Franz Wegeler, his childhood friend, he wrote, "My ears whistle and buzz continually day and night. I can say I am leading a wretched life. For the last 2 years, I have avoided almost all social gatherings because it is impossible for me to say to people, 'I am deaf.' If I belonged to any other profession, it would be easier, but in my profession, it is a frightful state." To Karl Amenda, another friend, he wrote, "Your Beethoven is living unhappily quarreling with nature and its creator often cursing the latter for exposing his creatures to the merest accident. Know that the noblest part of me, my hearing, has greatly deteriorated. The noblest part of me, my hearing. Can you imagine you are a musician? Music is not just what you do. It's who you are. It's your identity, your purpose, your entire reason for existing. And now that is being taken away from you slowly, inevitably, and there is nothing you can do to stop it. Beethoven became depressed. He withdrew from social situations. He became paranoid that people were talking about him, mocking him. When he couldn't hear what someone said, he would assume they were saying something cruel. His personality, which had always been difficult, became even more challenging. He was quick to anger. He was suspicious. He pushed people away even though he desperately needed connection. And through all of this, he kept composing. Because what else could he do? Music was all he had. Music was all he was. But the question that haunted him, the question that kept him awake at night, was this: how long can I continue? When I can no longer hear anything at all, how will I compose? How will I know if what I'm writing is beautiful or terrible? How will I survive? In April 1802, on the advice of yet another doctor, Beethoven left Vienna for the small village of Heiligenstadt, about 6 miles outside the city. The doctor hoped that rest, quiet, and rural air might help his hearing. It didn't. Beethoven spent 6 months in Heiligenstadt, from April to October 1802. These were 6 months of isolation, depression, and despair. He worked on his second symphony, but the joy had gone out of composition. Every day was a reminder of what he was losing. On October 6, 1802, Beethoven sat down and wrote a letter. It was addressed to his 2 brothers, Karl and Johann. It would become known as the Heiligenstadt Testament, and it is one of the most heartbreaking documents ever written by an artist. The letter begins, "O you men who think or say that I am malevolent, stubborn, or misanthropic, how greatly do you wrong me? You do not know the secret cause which makes me seem that way to you." He goes on to explain his deafness, describing how he has hidden it for 6 years, how humiliating it is to have people repeat themselves, how impossible it is to say, "Speak louder, shout, for I am deaf." Then comes the most devastating part. He writes about suicide. "I would have ended my life. It was only my art that held me back. It seemed to me impossible to leave the world until I had brought forth all that I felt was within me." Read that again. The only thing that kept Beethoven from killing himself was the music still inside his head that he hadn't yet written down. He continues, "O Providence, grant me at least but one day of pure joy. It is so long since real joy echoed in my heart. Oh, when shall I find it again in the temple of nature and of men? Never, no, that would be too hard." The letter goes on for several pages, swinging between despair and determination, between acceptance and rage. At the end, he adds a message to his brothers about his estate, as if he's already planning his death. But then something remarkable happened. Beethoven didn't mail the letter. He folded it up. He put it away. And he didn't mail it. It was found among his possessions after his death, 25 years later. Why didn't he mail it? Why write a suicide letter, pour out all that pain, and then not send it? Because between writing that letter and the end of October 1802, something changed in Beethoven. He made a decision. He decided that he would not let deafness destroy him. He would fight. He would compose. He would create music that was so powerful, so revolutionary, so undeniably brilliant that the world would have no choice but to listen, even if he could not. Years later, Beethoven would write in a letter, "I will seize fate by the throat. It shall certainly not bend and crush me completely." That was the decision made in Heiligenstadt. Fate had dealt him a crushing blow, but Beethoven would not bend. He would not break. He would fight back the only way he knew how, with music. When Beethoven returned to Vienna in October 1802, he was a changed man. The old Beethoven, the one who wanted to be the best pianist, the one who won duels and charmed aristocrats with his performances, that Beethoven was gone. In his place was someone harder, someone deeper, someone who had looked into the abyss of despair and chosen to keep walking. He stopped performing in public, partly because he could no longer hear well enough to play in ensembles, but also because performing no longer interested him. He was done being a piano virtuoso. From now on, he would be something more important. He would be a composer. Not just any composer. The composer. The one who would change music forever. He began work on his third symphony. But this would not be like his first two symphonies. This would be something entirely new. Something bigger. Something more ambitious than any symphony that had ever been written. Music historians often divide Beethoven's work into three periods. The early period from his arrival in Vienna to about 1802, when he was still working within the classical tradition. The late period from about 1815 until his death, when his music became abstract and almost spiritual. And then between those, there is the middle period. The middle period is when Beethoven became Beethoven. When he stopped being a talented composer and became a revolutionary. When he stopped following the rules and started breaking them, bending them, reshaping them into something the world had never heard before. And it began with his deafness, with his decision not to give up, with his determination to take his disability and transform it into something powerful. You see, there's a paradox at the heart of Beethoven's story. His greatest music, the works that would define him, the symphonies and sonatas and quartets that would change music forever. Almost all of them were composed after he began losing his hearing. Some of them were composed when he was completely deaf. How is that possible? How can someone who cannot hear create music? The answer is that Beethoven didn't hear music with his ears anymore. He heard it in his mind. He had such a complete understanding of how music worked, such a perfect internal sense of harmony and melody and rhythm, that he could compose entire symphonies in his head without ever hearing a single note out loud. He would write the music. Then the orchestra would play it. And only then would Beethoven find out if what he had imagined actually worked. Can you imagine the courage that took to write a massive symphony, to give it to an orchestra, to have it performed in front of thousands of people without being able to hear a single note yourself, without being able to fix anything if it went wrong? That was Beethoven's reality from 1802 onward. Composing in silence. Creating sound that he could never experience. And the first product of this new Beethoven, this transformed Beethoven who had chosen to seize fate by the throat, was the Third Symphony. They called it the Eroica, the heroic symphony, and it changed music forever. Beethoven began composing Symphony No. 3 in 1803 and completed it in 1804. From the very beginning, he knew this was going to be something special. He originally intended to dedicate it to Napoleon Bonaparte, the French general who had risen from common origins to lead a nation who represented the ideals of the French Revolution: liberty, equality, fraternity. Beethoven admired Napoleon. He saw him as a hero of the people, someone who had broken the old aristocratic systems and built something new. The symphony was going to be called Bonaparte. But in May 1804, news reached Vienna that Napoleon had declared himself Emperor of France. When Beethoven heard this, witnesses reported that he flew into a rage. He grabbed the title page of the symphony where he had written the dedication to Napoleon, and he tore it in half, shouting, "So he is no more than a common mortal. Now, too, he will tread underfoot all the rights of man, indulge only his ambition. Now he will think himself superior to all men, become a tyrant." Beethoven changed the dedication. The symphony would be called Sinfonia Eroica, the heroic symphony, composed to celebrate the memory of a great man. Not Napoleon specifically, just the ideal of heroism itself. The premiere took place in April 1805 at the Theater an der Wien in Vienna. The audience was not prepared for what they heard. The symphony was massive. The first movement alone was longer than entire symphonies by Mozart or Haydn. The whole work lasted nearly 50 minutes, almost twice the length of a typical symphony. It was loud. It was aggressive. It was emotionally overwhelming. The second movement was a funeral march, dark and heavy music for a hero's death. The third movement was a scherzo, playful, but with an edge of wildness. And the final movement was a set of variations that built and built until the entire orchestra was roaring. Some people in the audience were moved to tears. Others were confused, even angry. Critics wrote that the symphony was too long, too complex, too strange. One reviewer wrote, "It would gain immensely if Beethoven could be persuaded to shorten it and to bring more light clarity and unity into the whole." Beethoven ignored them. He knew what he had created. He had written a symphony that wasn't just music. It was a story. It was a statement. It was a portrait of struggle, tragedy, and ultimate triumph. The Eroica Symphony marked the beginning of the Romantic era in music. It proved that a symphony could be about ideas, about emotions, about the human condition. It wasn't just entertainment anymore. It was art. And Beethoven was just getting started. Over the next few years, Beethoven composed at a furious pace. Piano sonatas, string quartets, violin concertos. His one and only opera, Fidelio, about a woman who disguises herself as a man to rescue her husband from prison, a story about love and freedom that Beethoven revised obsessively because he could never get it quite right. But the works that would define this period, that would become some of the most famous pieces of music ever written, were Symphony No. 5 and Symphony No. 6, both premiered on the same concert in December 1808. Let's start with the Fifth Symphony. Even if you think you don't know it, you do. The opening four notes are probably the most famous four notes in all of classical music. Da 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 doom. That's it. 4 notes. 3 short, 1 long. In musical terms, it's the simplest possible motif. But what Beethoven does with those 4 notes is extraordinary. He builds the entire first movement around them. They appear in different instruments, at different speeds, in different keys. They transform from something aggressive into something triumphant. Those 4 notes become the entire symphony. Beethoven reportedly told his assistant that this motif represented fate knocking at the door. Whether he actually said that, or whether it's a legend, we don't know. But it fits. The entire symphony feels like a battle against fate, against destiny, against forces trying to crush you. And in the final movement, the music explodes into a glorious C major triumph. Fate knocked, and Beethoven answered by refusing to surrender. The Fifth Symphony was revolutionary because it proved that music could have narrative structure. It could tell a story without words. It could take you on an emotional journey from darkness to light. And then there's the Sixth Symphony, which premiered immediately after the Fifth on that same marathon concert in December 1808. The concert lasted over 4 hours, by the way, and the theater wasn't heated, and it was the middle of winter. The audience must have been freezing. Where the Fifth Symphony is all drama and struggle, the Sixth Symphony, called the Pastoral, is about peace and nature. Beethoven loved walking in the countryside around Vienna. He would take long walks every day, regardless of weather. He said that his best ideas came to him while walking. The Pastoral Symphony is 5 movements, instead of the traditional 4, and each movement has a title. Awakening of cheerful feelings on arrival in the countryside. Scene by the brook. Merry gathering of country folk. Thunderstorm. Shepherd's song. Cheerful and thankful feelings after the storm. It's program music that tells a specific story. You can hear the brook bubbling. You can hear the thunderstorm approaching. You can hear birds singing. The entire symphony is a musical painting of a day in the country. What's remarkable is that these 2 symphonies, so different in character, were composed during the same period by the same man. The Fifth, all struggle and fate and triumph. The Sixth, all peace and nature and contentment. Together they show the full range of Beethoven's genius, and he was composing them while going deaf. His hearing continued to deteriorate. By 1808, he could barely hear the piano when he played it himself. Conversation was nearly impossible. He was withdrawing further and further into isolation. But the music kept coming. Because Beethoven wasn't hearing the music with his ears anymore. He was hearing it in his mind. And in his mind, he could hear everything. While working on these massive symphonies, Beethoven was also composing piano music that would become some of the most beloved pieces in the classical repertoire. In 1801, he composed the Piano Sonata No. 14 in C-sharp minor. He didn't give it a title. But after his death, a German music critic compared it to moonlight shining on Lake Lucerne, and the name stuck. The Moonlight Sonata. The first movement of the Moonlight Sonata is one of the most hauntingly beautiful pieces of music ever written for piano. It's slow melancholy, almost meditative. The melody floats above rolling, broken chords that sound like waves. It feels like loneliness, like longing, like sadness so deep, there are no words for it. Beethoven dedicated this sonata to Giulietta Guicciardi, one of his piano students. He was in love with her. She was 17. He was 30. She was an aristocrat. He was a commoner. The relationship, such as it was, went nowhere. She eventually married someone else. But the music remains a monument to love and loss. Then there's the Piano Sonata No. 8, the Pathétique, which we mentioned earlier. And the Piano Sonata No. 23, the Appassionata, so passionate and technically demanding that it's considered one of the hardest sonatas to perform. And then there's Für Elise, probably the most famous piano piece Beethoven ever wrote, though he never published it during his lifetime. It was discovered 40 years after his death. The piece was originally called Bagatelle in a minor, and scholars still argue about who Elise was. Was it Thérèse Malfatti, another woman Beethoven loved and lost, and the name was transcribed wrong? Was it Elisabeth Röckel, an opera singer? We don't know. But millions of piano students around the world have played this piece, struggling through its tricky middle section. During this same period, Beethoven was also working on his only opera, Fidelio. Opera was never Beethoven's strength. He was a symphonic composer, a master of instrumental music. Adding words and staging and drama on top of the music was challenging for him. Fidelio is about Leonore, a woman whose husband, Florestan, has been unjustly imprisoned by a corrupt governor named Pizarro. Leonore disguises herself as a young man named Fidelio and gets a job working in the prison, hoping to rescue her husband. The opera is about love. Yes, but more than that, it's about freedom, about justice, about refusing to accept tyranny. These themes were deeply important to Beethoven. He believed in the ideals of the French Revolution, in equality, in human rights, in freedom. But he had seen how those ideals had been corrupted first by Napoleon, then by the conservative forces that crushed the revolutionary movements across Europe. Fidelio went through multiple revisions. It premiered in 1805, and Beethoven wasn't satisfied. He revised it in 1806. Still not right. He revised it again in 1814. That version finally succeeded. But even after all that work, Fidelio is not considered one of Beethoven's greatest achievements. It's admired, yes, but it's not performed as often as his symphonies. Because Beethoven's genius wasn't in opera. His genius was in pure instrumental music, in taking sound without words, without specific stories, and making you feel things you didn't know you could feel. And he was about to face his greatest challenge, because by 1812, his hearing was almost gone, and by 1814, it would be gone completely. Ludwig van Beethoven, the greatest composer alive, would spend the rest of his life in total silence. By 1814, Beethoven's hearing was gone, completely, totally, irreversibly. He could not hear conversation. He could not hear the piano. He could not hear the street noise outside his window. He lived in absolute silence, broken only by the constant ringing and buzzing in his ears that never stopped. Communication became nearly impossible. If you wanted to talk to Beethoven, you had to write your questions and comments in a book, what became known as his conversation books. Beethoven would read what you wrote, then respond out loud. But he couldn't hear his own voice, so he often spoke too loudly, shouting responses to whispered questions. Over 600 of these conversation books survive today. They're a fascinating but heartbreaking record of his final years. You can read one side of conversations, see people trying to help him, trying to connect with him, trying to manage his daily life. And you can imagine Beethoven isolated in silence, dependent on these written exchanges for any human connection. He became increasingly suspicious and paranoid. When he couldn't hear what people were saying, he assumed they were talking about him. He accused friends of stealing from him. He had violent arguments that destroyed lifelong relationships. His temper, always short, became explosive. His living conditions deteriorated. He moved frequently, sometimes living in multiple apartments at once, because he couldn't remember where he'd stored things. His apartments were famously messy, cluttered with papers, manuscripts, dirty dishes, chamber pots that went unemptied. Servants wouldn't work for him because of his temper. Friends who visited were often shocked by the conditions. But through all of this, he kept composing. He would sit at his piano, pressing the keys, but unable to hear what sounds they made. He would write music in his notebooks, hearing every note, every harmony, every orchestral color in his mind. This is what's almost impossible to comprehend. Beethoven was composing music he would never hear. Never. Not even once. He would write a symphony, give it to an orchestra, they would perform it, audiences would react, and he would have no direct experience of it. He could only see people's faces, see their applause and trust that what he had imagined in his mind had somehow translated into reality. The loneliness of this is almost unbearable to contemplate. Music was Beethoven's entire life, his only way of connecting with the world, his deepest form of self-expression. And he was locked out of it. He could create it, but he could never experience it. He wrote in a letter to his friend, Marie Pachler-Koschak, "I live entirely in my music, and hardly have I completed one composition when I have already begun another. At my present rate of composing, I often produce 3 or 4 works at the same time." In his music, that's where he lived. Not in Vienna, not in his messy apartments, not in his deteriorating relationships, in his music, in the internal world of sound that existed only in his mind. But Beethoven was still human, and humans need love. He had spent his entire adult life falling in love with women he couldn't have. Aristocratic women, married women, women whose families would never allow them to marry a commoner, no matter how famous he was. In July 1812, Beethoven wrote a letter. Actually, it's 3 letters written over 3 days, July 6th and 7th. They're addressed simply to "my immortal beloved." These letters are some of the most passionate, most emotionally raw love letters ever written. They begin, "My angel, all my very self." Only a few words today, and at that with pencil, with yours. Not till tomorrow will my lodgings be definitely determined upon. What a useless waste of time. He goes on. Can our love endure except through sacrifices, through not demanding everything? Can you change the fact that you are not wholly mine, I not wholly thine? And, O God, look out into the beauties of nature and comfort your heart with that which must be. Love demands everything, and that very justly. Thus it is to me with you, and to you with me. The letters were found in a secret drawer in Beethoven's desk after his death. They were never sent. We don't know why. We don't even know for certain who they were written to. The identity of the immortal beloved has been one of the great mysteries of music history. Scholars have spent 200 years trying to figure it out. Was it Antonia Brentano, the wife of a Frankfurt merchant? Was it Josephine Brunswick, a countess he had known for years? Was it someone else entirely? We may never know. What we do know is that Beethoven, despite all his success, despite his genius, despite his fame, never found lasting romantic love. He never married. He never had children of his own. He lived alone. And as his deafness worsened, that aloneness became almost total isolation. The letters to the immortal beloved represent what might have been. A life where love was possible, where connection was possible, where Beethoven wasn't trapped in silence. But that life didn't happen. Instead, Beethoven had only his music, and one other relationship that would define and nearly destroy his final years: his relationship with his nephew Karl. In November 1815, Beethoven's brother Caspar Karl died of tuberculosis. Caspar had a son, Karl, who was 9 years old. In his will, Caspar appointed both his widow Johanna and his brother Ludwig as Karl's guardians. Beethoven hated Johanna. He considered her immoral because she had been convicted of embezzlement years earlier. He decided that Karl needed to be rescued from her influence. And so Beethoven began a 5-year legal battle to gain sole custody of his nephew. It was ugly. Beethoven said terrible things about Johanna in court, calling her unfit, immoral, a bad influence. The courts went back and forth. Sometimes Karl would live with Beethoven. Sometimes he'd be sent back to his mother. The boy was torn between them, never sure where he belonged. Beethoven poured all his unfulfilled need for love and family into this relationship. But he was a terrible guardian. He was overprotective to the point of suffocation. He couldn't hear when Karl spoke, so he couldn't have normal conversations. He would fly into rages over small issues. He moved constantly, so Karl had no stable home. Worst of all, Beethoven had impossibly high expectations. He wanted Karl to be perfect, to be grateful, to dedicate his life to caring for his uncle. But Karl was just a boy, then a teenager, then a young man who wanted to live his own life. The tension built for years. In the summer of 1826, when Karl was 19, he took 2 pistols and went up to the ruins of Rauhenstein Castle outside Vienna. He put 1 pistol to each side of his head and pulled both triggers. He survived. The bullets grazed his skull, but didn't penetrate. He was found and taken home. When Beethoven found out that Karl had tried to kill himself, he was devastated. He couldn't understand. He had given Karl everything. He had fought for years to save him from his mother. Why would Karl do this? But of course, Beethoven couldn't see that his own behavior, his overwhelming need, his inability to let Karl simply be his own person, had contributed to the boy's desperation. After recovering, Karl joined the army and moved away from Vienna. He and Beethoven maintained a distant relationship, but the damage was done. Beethoven's attempt to create a family to not be alone had ended in tragedy. And through all of this, through the custody battles and the arguments and Karl's suicide attempt, Beethoven was composing. Because that was all he had. That was all he had ever had. And in those final years, in complete deafness, in isolation, in personal failure, Beethoven created some of the most sublime music ever written, including his final symphony. Symphony No. 9. The one that would premiere in May 1824 at the Theater am Kärntner Tor, where 3,000 people would give him a standing ovation he couldn't hear. Beethoven began thinking about his 9th symphony as early as 1815, but he didn't begin serious work on it until 1822. He was 52 years old, completely deaf, increasingly isolated, his health declining, his relationship with Karl deteriorating. But he had an idea that had been building in his mind for decades. He wanted to write a symphony that included voices. Not just instruments, but human voices singing. This had never been done before in a symphony. Some composers had experimented with it, but no one had attempted it on the scale Beethoven was imagining. And he knew what the voices would sing. A poem by Friedrich Schiller called An die Freude Ode to Joy. Beethoven had loved this poem since he was a young man. It celebrated the brotherhood of all mankind, the idea that joy connects us all, that beyond the divisions of nationality and class and religion, we are all brothers and sisters. All men become brothers, the poem said. That was Beethoven's belief. That was what he wanted his final symphony to say. He worked on the 9th symphony for 2 years. It was massive. 4 movements, each one longer and more complex than anything he'd written before. The first movement was dramatic and stormy. The second was a scherzo, almost violent in its energy. The third was slow and meditative, one of the most beautiful movements he ever composed. And then the 4th movement. This was where everything came together. It begins with a shocking moment, a loud, dissonant chord that sounds almost angry. Then fragments of the previous 3 movements are played and rejected. The cellos and basses begin a new melody, simple and beautiful. The Ode to Joy theme. The theme builds gradually. First, just the basses. Then more instruments join. It grows and grows until the entire orchestra is playing. And then, for the first time in symphonic history, the human voice enters. A baritone soloist sings "O Freunde, nicht diese Töne", sondern lasst uns angenehmere anstimmen und freudenvollere. "O friends, not these sounds." Let us instead strike up more pleasing and joyful ones, and then the chorus joins in singing. Schiller's words. Freude schöner, Götterfunken, Tochter aus Elysium. Joy, beautiful spark of divinity, daughter from Elysium. The final movement lasts nearly 30 minutes. It's a series of variations on the Ode to Joy theme building in complexity and power until the very end, when the full chorus and orchestra unite in a massive celebration of joy and brotherhood. Beethoven composed all of this while completely deaf. He never heard a single note of it while writing it. He imagined every instrument, every voice, every harmony in his mind. He wrote it down, and he trusted that it would work. The premiere of Symphony No. 9 took place on May 7, 1824, at the Theater am Korntnertor in Vienna. It had been 12 years since Beethoven's last major public concert. 12 years of increasing isolation and deafness. Many people wondered if he was even still composing. The concert was going to be a major event. In addition to the Ninth Symphony, the program included parts of his Missa Solemnis, one of his late sacred works. The theater was packed. Over 3,000 people filled every seat, every box, every inch of standing room. Beethoven was going to conduct the performance, but everyone knew he couldn't actually conduct. He was completely deaf. He wouldn't be able to hear the orchestra or keep time. So a plan was arranged. Beethoven would stand on the stage and he would make conducting gestures. But the actual conducting would be done by Michael Umlauf, the theater's music director, who would stand behind Beethoven where the orchestra could see him. The musicians were instructed to ignore Beethoven completely and follow only Umlauf. Can you imagine how that must have felt? To be Beethoven standing on stage believing you are conducting your greatest work, while in reality, you are just making meaningless gestures while someone behind you does the real work. But Beethoven didn't know. He couldn't hear. He couldn't tell that his gestures didn't match the music. He conducted his own internal version of the symphony, the one that existed in his mind. The performance began. The first movement, powerful and dramatic. Beethoven's arms moved wildly, sometimes ahead of the music, sometimes behind. The orchestra played on following Umlauf. The second movement, the fierce scherzo. Beethoven conducted his imaginary orchestra while the real one performed beside him. The third movement, the slow, beautiful adagio. Beethoven's conducting became gentler, matching the mood of the music he remembered. And then the fourth movement, the revolutionary finale, with voices. The baritone soloist, the chorus, the orchestra, all building to the massive climax, the celebration of joy and brotherhood. When it ended, the audience exploded. 3,000 people leapt to their feet. They applauded. They waved handkerchiefs. They shouted "Vivat!" They called for Beethoven. They wouldn't stop. The applause went on and on. It was so enthusiastic that the police officers stationed in the theater had to remind the audience that such extended applause was reserved only for the imperial family. It was actually against the law to applaud that much. But the audience didn't care. They kept applauding. And through all of this, Ludwig van Beethoven stood on the stage, his back to the audience, facing the orchestra, completely unaware of what was happening. He couldn't hear the applause. He couldn't hear the shouting. He didn't know if the performance had been a success or a disaster. He stood there slightly confused about why no one was moving, why the orchestra was putting down their instruments, but no one seemed to be leaving. Finally, Caroline Unger, the contralto soloist who had sung in the finale, realized what was happening. She walked over to Beethoven. She gently took his arm, and she turned him around to face the audience. That's when Beethoven saw it. 3,000 people standing, hands raised, waving, mouths open in cheers he couldn't hear, handkerchiefs fluttering like white birds, faces looking at him with awe, with joy, with tears streaming down their cheeks. They were applauding for him, for his music, for what he had created. Beethoven's face crumpled. Witnesses reported that tears ran down his cheeks. He bowed awkwardly, his movements stiff and uncertain. He bowed again and again. The applause continued. It wouldn't stop. Think about what this moment must have been like. For over a decade, Beethoven had been isolated in silence. He had watched his hearing disappear. He had written music he could never hear. He had poured everything he had into his compositions, never knowing if they were truly as beautiful as he imagined them to be. And now, seeing 3,000 faces, seeing their reaction, he finally knew. It had worked. What he imagined in silence had become sound in the world. And it was glorious. Years later, people who were present at that premiere would say it was the most moving moment they had ever witnessed in a theater. Not just because of the music, though the music was extraordinary, but because of what it represented. Here was a man who had been given every reason to give up. Childhood abuse, poverty, the loss of the one sense that defined his entire existence, isolation, loneliness, personal failure. And yet he had not given up. He had seized fate by the throat, exactly as he had promised himself back in Heiligenstadt in 1802. He had taken his suffering and transformed it into something beautiful, something that brought joy to thousands of people, something that would bring joy to millions more over the next 2 centuries. The Ninth Symphony wasn't just music. It was proof that the human spirit could triumph over any obstacle, that creativity could flourish even in darkness, that beauty could be born from suffering. That performance on May 7, 1824, was Beethoven's greatest triumph. It was vindication for everything he had endured. It was his statement to the world that he had won. Deafness had tried to destroy him, and he had refused to be destroyed. But it was also, in a way, the beginning of the end, because Beethoven had given everything to that symphony. He had poured his entire soul into it. And now it was done. His life's work was complete. He would compose a few more pieces in the remaining years, string quartets, small piano pieces, but nothing on the scale of the Ninth Symphony, nothing that would define him further. The rest of his life would be decline, illness, pain, and finally death. But on that night in May 1824, none of that mattered. On that night, Ludwig van Beethoven stood before 3,000 people and knew that he had created something immortal, something that would outlive him, something that would carry his voice into a future he would never see. He had won. After the triumph of the Ninth Symphony, Beethoven's life spiraled into darkness. His health, which had been poor for years, deteriorated rapidly. He suffered from liver disease, probably caused by decades of heavy drinking. He had chronic stomach problems. He had jaundice. He was in constant pain. His relationship with his nephew Karl reached its breaking point in the summer of 1826, when Karl attempted suicide. The aftermath left Beethoven emotionally shattered. He felt he had failed. Failed as a guardian. Failed as a father figure. Failed as a human being. In December 1826, Beethoven traveled with Karl to visit his brother Johann in Gneixendorf, a village outside Vienna. The visit was not pleasant. Beethoven and Johann argued constantly. Karl was distant and resentful. Beethoven was sick and growing sicker. When they returned to Vienna in early December, Beethoven was gravely ill. The journey back had been made in an open carriage in freezing weather. He developed pneumonia on top of his other ailments. He took to his bed and never really recovered. Over the next 3 months, he grew progressively weaker. His abdomen swelled with fluid, a symptom of liver failure. Doctors performed surgery 4 times to drain the fluid, but it kept coming back. The treatments of that era, bloodletting cold compresses, did nothing to help. Beethoven knew he was dying. In early March 1827, he received last rites. He put his affairs in order. He made Karl his sole heir, despite everything that had happened between them. Friends came to visit. Schubert, the young composer who worshipped Beethoven, came to pay his respects. Beethoven was too weak to speak much, but he acknowledged the visit. On March 23, 1827, Beethoven slipped into a coma. He lingered for 3 more days unconscious. His breathing labored. According to legend, on the afternoon of March 26th, a thunderstorm broke over Vienna. Thunder crashed. Lightning split the sky. At the height of the storm, Beethoven suddenly opened his eyes. He raised his right fist toward the ceiling as if shaking it at the heavens, defiant to the very end. Then he fell back, and he died. Whether that story is true, we don't know. It sounds too perfect, too much like something from a romantic novel. Beethoven facing death the same way he faced life, with his fist raised against fate. But this much is true. Ludwig van Beethoven died on March 26, 1827, at 5:45 in the afternoon. He was 56 years old. His funeral was held 3 days later on March 29th. Over 20,000 people attended. That was nearly 1/5 of Vienna's entire population. The streets were so crowded that the funeral procession could barely move. Schools were closed so children could attend. Shops shut down. The entire city came out to mourn. Franz Schubert was one of the torchbearers in the procession. He would die less than 2 years later, also at a young age, also without achieving the recognition he deserved during his lifetime. Beethoven was buried in the Währing Cemetery. In 1888, his remains were moved to the Central Cemetery in Vienna, where they remain today, not far from the graves of Schubert, Brahms, and other musical giants. At Beethoven's graveside, the actor Heinrich Anschutz read a funeral oration written by the poet Franz Grillparzer. Part of it said, "He was an artist, but also a man in every sense in the highest. Because he withdrew from the world, they called him hostile, and because he avoided sentimentality, unfeeling. Oh, he who knows he is hardened does not flee. It is the most delicate points that are most easily blunted, bent, or broken." The funeral oration ends. He fled the world because he did not find in the whole compass of his loving nature a weapon to oppose it. He withdrew from his fellow men after he had given them everything and had received nothing in return. He remained alone because he found no second self. But until his death, he preserved a human heart for all men, a father's heart for his own people, the whole world. Until his death, he preserved a human heart for all men. That's what Beethoven's music was. His heart given to the world when the world had given him so little in return. 200 years have passed, since Beethoven's death. In those 2 centuries, music has changed in ways he never could have imagined. But everything, and I mean everything in Western classical music after Beethoven exists in his shadow. Beethoven didn't just compose music, he transformed what music could be. Before Beethoven, music was entertainment. It was background for social events. It was pleasant. It was beautiful. But it wasn't meant to shake your soul. After Beethoven, music became art. It became philosophy. It became a way to express the deepest truths about the human experience. It became something that demanded your full attention, your emotional engagement, your intellectual understanding. Every composer who came after Beethoven had to deal with his legacy. Brahms famously struggled for years to write his first symphony, because he felt Beethoven's symphonies, especially the Ninth, looming over him like a giant. When Brahms finally completed his first symphony, a critic called it Beethoven's 10th. That's both a compliment and a burden. Mahler, Bruckner, Tchaikovsky. All the great symphonic composers of the 19th century, they were all responding to Beethoven, building on what he started, trying to find their own voices while acknowledging his influence. Even composers who rebelled against the Romantic tradition, who went in completely different directions in the 20th century, were still defined by their relationship to Beethoven. You can't escape his gravity. And it's not just classical music. The idea that music should express deep personal emotion, that it should challenge you, that it should mean something beyond just pleasant sounds, that philosophy has influenced every genre of music that came after. Rock, jazz, hip-hop, electronic music. All of it in some way descends from the revolution Beethoven started. The Ninth Symphony's Ode to Joy has become more than just music. It's been adopted as the anthem of the European Union. It's performed at major political events around the world. It's become a symbol of hope, of unity, of the brotherhood of mankind that Beethoven believed in. And here's the deepest irony of all. The music that has brought joy to hundreds of millions of people over 2 centuries, music that has been played at weddings and celebrations and moments of triumph, music that represents the highest expression of human joy, was created by a man who lived in silence. Beethoven never heard the Ninth Symphony. He never heard the Ode to Joy. He never heard the applause of those 3,000 people standing and cheering at the premiere. He created all of it in his mind, in his imagination, in the internal world of sound that was all he had left. That's the miracle of Beethoven. Not just that he composed great music, but that he composed great music about joy, about hope, about human connection while living in isolation, in silence, in pain. He took his suffering and transformed it into something beautiful. He took his disability and refused to let it define him. He took every obstacle that fate threw at him, and he turned it into art. So what can we learn from Ludwig van Beethoven's story? Maybe it's that genius is not just talent. It's not just being good at something. Genius is about refusing to give up. It's about facing obstacles that would crush most people and choosing to keep going anyway. It's about taking your pain and your struggle and your suffering and transforming it into something that outlives you. Beethoven could have given up in Heiligenstadt in 1802. He could have sent that suicide letter. He could have ended it all right there. And if he had, we would have lost everything that came after. The Eroica, the Fifth and Sixth Symphonies, the late string quartets, the Ninth Symphony, all of it would have been silenced before it was born. But he didn't give up. He chose to keep creating. He chose to seize fate by the throat. And because he made that choice, the world is richer, more beautiful, more meaningful. Today, over 200 years after his death, Beethoven's music is played somewhere in the world every single day. Every single day, orchestras perform his symphonies, pianists play his sonatas, singers perform his Ode to Joy. His music has been to space on the Voyager spacecraft, literally carrying a human message to the stars. The deaf composer's music has traveled further than any sound ever has. It will outlast all of us. It will probably outlast our civilization. Long after we're gone somewhere, somehow Beethoven's music will still exist. That's the power of art. That's the power of refusing to surrender. That's the legacy of a man who created beauty in silence. If this story moved you, if it inspired you, if it made you think differently about what's possible in the face of impossible odds, please subscribe to this channel. Click the notification bell so you never miss these stories. And tell me in the comments, which city and country are you listening from? What did Beethoven's story mean to you? Share this video with someone who needs to hear it, someone who's facing their own struggles, someone who needs to be reminded that obstacles can be overcome, that disability doesn't mean inability, that the human spirit is stronger than any fate. Thank you for listening to this story. Thank you for taking the time to remember Ludwig van Beethoven, not just as a composer, but as a human being who suffered, who struggled, who loved, who failed, and who created beauty anyway. Until next time, keep listening, keep learning, keep remembering. These stories matter. These lives matter. And the lessons they teach us matter more than ever. Thank you.